And now to our roundtable. We are joined by Colin Reed, who is the chair of the Economics and Finance Department at SUNY Plattsburgh and a columnist with the Plattsburgh Press-Republican. And Jay Bryan is a former business and economics writer who has recently retired as a columnist with the Montreal Gazette. Nice to have you both here. We welcome you. Let's begin with President Obama and his push to slash carbon emissions. Is this the most significant step that he and really the nation have taken yet to address climate change?
It's a pretty gutsy call if you think about it. He's talking about reducing emissions by 30% from coal-fired plants, which are by far and away the dirtiest way of generating electricity, especially with regard to carbon. He's talking about, by some estimates, between 2020 and 2030, the goal. So if you think about expected GDP growth, expected increased demand for energy as a consequence by then you pile on that a 30% reduction from 2014 levels of power generation or emissions, that actually ends up being a very sizable, close to 50% cut in actual emissions.
In a strange way, the United States is a very lucky country in this regard because it has so much room to cut carbon emissions. It's the world's biggest carbon emitter per capita and was the biggest overall until China recently surpassed it. And it uses coal to generate a very high percentage of its electricity, much higher than in Canada, much higher than you'd find typically in Europe. So that makes it quite a lot easier to cut back your carbon emissions drastically as long as you can withstand the intense political pressure that will be coming from a well-financed coal industry and a number of coal state legislators.
Exactly. We're already hearing there will be political pushback. There will be lawsuits, undoubtedly. Yes. So this is a challenge for the administration. It's going to take several months to play out anyway, a comment period, and then to see what the pushback is. When we talk about 30% cut, and that's what we've been hearing from this proposal, as you mentioned, Colin, this is set though to 2005 levels. So a number of power plants have already made some cutback. So it surely won't be about a 30%
17.
Cut.
About 17 from where we are now.
It's been about 13.
Because the low price of natural gas, largely thanks to fracking, means that natural market forces are shoving coal out of the market, which is a good thing. It's a good example for Americans who are kind of worried about what happens when we move away from our conventional sources of power to something that's cleaner, that you can move to at least one thing that is considerably cleaner and save money doing it. The price of wind power and the price of solar power have been plunging dramatically, so that neither one of them makes up a very significant percentage of the country's electricity needs now. But you can go from a very, very small percentage to a much larger one pretty fast if you get down to the place where people can get clean energy just as cheaply or perhaps more cheaply than dirty energy. And finally, a third source, which has been, I think, proven to be much cheaper than dirty energy or any other kind of energy, is efficiency. One recent study showed that energy efficiency, the kilowatt that you don't generate just by having programs to stop industry and stop homeowners from wasting power, that not wasted kilowatt saves you having to build new generating capacity, and it costs about a third as much as actually building the new generating capacity. And of course it also saves you the pollution, which by the way is not just carbon emissions, but as the Environmental Protection Agency pointed out in making this announcement this week, it also saves you a number of people being quite sick from asthma and other respiratory diseases, and thousands of people who die prematurely because of that sort of thing.
So the health concerns. There is flexibility. There's flexibility for the states. There's flexibility for the power plants as far as how it's implemented, and also adapting alternative energy to help reduce the amount that they need to cut back.
Things like energy efficiency. Sorry.
He's leaving it up primarily to the states to figure out how they're going to meet that, which is a good idea to allow states some flexibility in meeting those targets.
Yeah. So this primarily goes after the coal-fired power plants.
Yes, although it isn't legally targeting the coal-fired power plants, it's simply targeting power plants. It does happen that coal-fired power plants are the filthiest ones around by a very wide margin, but you know, in some states it might lead them to shut down or not build a natural gas-fired power plant, because there are some carbon emissions from natural gas, in favor of conceivably nuclear or certainly maybe some wind power or some solar power.
And these are existing power plants because new ones probably are already much cleaner.
You're talking about natural gas plants now, I assume?
Different alternative types of energy producing
especially
electricity.
combined cycle ones.
The other nice aspect of this, I think, is that finally some of our allies are saying that the U.S. is taking steps in the whole carbon tax regime. We've been reluctant to up till now. And until we do, none of our trading partners really feel the need to do it either. So this is viewed as us stepping forward, and if this could be the first step in moving towards a global carbon tax, you know, if you think of energy as 15 to 20% of our economy, and the global economy being valued somewhere around $60 trillion or so, we're talking about $10 trillion industry here. Even a modest carbon tax of 5 or 10% on that $10 trillion leaves you with $500 billion, $1 trillion of actually revenue we can do to try to abate global warming and some of these other, and move towards some of these other efficiency standards that Jay was talking about.
And looking at the kind of the nexus between climate change abatement and politics, this will remove, unless it's struck down by the Supreme Court, the only big excuse left to huge developing countries, principally China, also India, for doing not so much on their own and for continuing to build coal-fired plants, because they say, and they say quite rightly, why are you coming after us? The richest nation in the world, the most powerful nation in the world, hasn't really lifted a finger to fight this problem. If the most powerful nation in the world is lifting a finger to fight this problem, and if the other really powerful economic force in the world, the European community, is already, I think, fairly well advanced in fighting climate change, that really leaves these guys kind of standing out, sticking out like a sore thumb, and puts tremendous pressure on them to make advances.
I know for critics, that's one of the biggest arguments is you can clean the air here. What good does it do if the dirty air from China still ends up all over the globe and drifting into the U.S.?
That's kind of like the argument that, you know, sure you can dig a foundation for the house, but you know, then if you jump down into that hole, you'll still get rained on because there's no house there. You've got to start someplace, right? And usually the first step is the hardest step to take.
The point you made, does this give the U.S. more credibility to go to China and say, well, we're taking these steps now, you need to as well?
It does. I don't think the U.S. will exercise that credibility, but other countries will, on U.S.'s behalf, exercise it. A country like Canada could now then say, hey, we're trying to clean up our act. We see the states cleaning up their act. Let's really move closer to all of us following the Kyoto Protocol.
You could see a sort of an agreement among the major developed nations of the world to impose a carbon import tax on products from countries that aren't doing anything about mitigating climate change. And as you mentioned Canada, you could also see the government of Canada, which has been, if anything, more inactive than the government of the United States. The government of Canada and the government of Australia are a couple of very bad actors environmentally, because both countries depend heavily on resource extraction, and so it's kind of painful to have to fight your climate change issues in a country like Canada that has all those tar sands. Well, I think this will give the United States a very, very strong moral argument, at least, to tell Canada, hey guys, come on.
The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has come out against this, saying that it'll cost more than $200 billion over the 15 years that it takes to implement it, cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. Utility rates will go up. Basically thinking of a number of arguments to oppose this.
The other arguments that you see, for example, from the Environmental Protection Agency, which obviously wants to defend its own policy, but also which is a government agency, so they can't kind of play with the figures the way a private lobby group can, that the benefits will outweigh the costs by about 10 to 1. For example, we won't have people dying from air pollution. And I know private analysts who don't agree with the Chamber of Commerce, which is strangely closely in sync with coal industry interests rather than with cleaner parts of American industry, just ridicule the Chamber of Commerce analysis, not because it's a bad analysis, it's an okay analysis, but because the costs that they talk about are so minuscule in comparison to the total cost of the American economy. Paul Krugman, the liberal economist and columnist, likened it to the Dr. Evil character in the movies who said that he was going to hold the world to ransom and charge you $1 million. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the American economy.
Let's talk about the political battle, the political cloud of the coal industry. The president had before pitched cap and trade, and that went nowhere with the Republicans. So he's doing an end around here. He's bypassing Congress to do this.
Mm-hmm. That's not entirely fair. That is the argument that's being made, that this is another case of Obama executive overreach. In fact, no matter who the president was, President Obama or some other president, that president would have no choice but to let the Environmental Protection Agency do something to regulate carbon emissions, because the EPA is required to regulate any air pollutant that has any effect on Americans. And the Bush administration had said that, well, carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, so it doesn't come under that rule. Well, there was a Supreme Court case several years ago that said, well, yeah, it is a pollutant and the EPA is required. So it's true that I guess the Obama administration could have done something smaller, but it's not true that they could have done nothing.
But make no mistake, this is quite a political issue.
Absolutely
political battle.
Yes.
And a number of Democrats in red states went to the administration and said, don't do this before Election Day.
Yeah.
Well, it's big too in that this is a little bit different than simply being a pollutant, although he made the announcement with the American Lung Association by his side. I mean, it is a pollutant, but it also is a global warming gas. It's a carbon issue. So now we're really taking that first foray into recognizing the global warming as a phenomenon. People still may disagree about whether it's man-made or not, but we do recognize that carbon levels are higher than in the last, millennia after millennia, and that we can do something to abate it, even if we can still quarrel over the cause of it.
And this moves the United States from having done virtually nothing to having done something quite significant, following something in the previous Obama administration, just before the last election, which was greatly improving the fuel efficiency standards that are needed, because power plants are the biggest source of global warming gases, and transportation, mostly cars and trucks, is the second biggest source of global warming gases. So Obama has gone from being a guy who was considered by environmentalists to be kind of a do-nothing guy, to being a president who's done a lot more than any other to attack this problem.
And to wrap it up, we've had a week now to digest this, the consensus. Will this make a difference?
Well, it has to make a difference.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sure it will. I think it's very significant.
I agree.
Let's talk about the other big story of the week. Billionaire investor Carl Icahn and pro golfer Phil Mickelson. Their names have come up as part of an insider trading investigation being conducted by the FBI, the SEC, and federal prosecutors. I guess the thought is that perhaps Carl Icahn tipped off a friend in Las Vegas who may have in turn passed on information to Mickelson, and that there was some improper trading in advance of Icahn's failed bid to buy Clorox back in 2011 for $12.5 billion. Everyone has denied any wrongdoing or knowledge of any investigation. Are these cases notoriously hard for federal prosecutors to prove and get convictions?
They're incredibly hard, although in this example we do see Martha Stewart was convicted
back in 2004 and went to prison for 4 months, but in many other cases, do they ever
especially if you have
get convictions?
a person who's a very active trader, it's hard to say whether that was just a mere coincidence or whether they were acting on insider information. The SEC has been really under the gun lately to try to take some of the people that committed frauds and improprieties in the global financial meltdown to task, and there's been very, very few convictions, just because based on the standard of proof, these are just incredibly hard to prove. Now we could change the legislation, change that that line we have to establish in the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to something like preponderance of the evidence or a clear and present danger kind of standard. But unless we're willing to do that, as long as these guys have plausible deniability and that they just did some good analysis, it's really difficult. You really need to have good documentation exactly of that smoking gun.
Or you need to have a ring of insider traders
willing to think on each other.
That's right, and who commit the offense again and again and again and again, so you have multiple opportunities to find out what they're doing, and then to get wiretaps, and then to get incontrovertible evidence. Because Colin's absolutely right. It's just about impossible to prove if all you have is some guy buying a ton of shares of some company when he's never bought shares in that company before, and then magically a takeover bid is announced the next day, and the guy makes an enormous profit. That's just not enough in court.
And Carl Icahn has been part of how many deals through the years, and he says he's always had a clean record and never any of these allegations before, which...
Well, and you wouldn't have to, because when you're planning a deal that big, there's more than one person involved in doing the planning, and if anybody has loose lips, that's enough.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about another story this week, the Olympics. It seems that the International Olympic Committee is having a hard time finding cities to bid on the 2022 Winter Games. I don't know if it's because of Vladimir Putin setting the bar at $50 billion for Sochi. Beijing spent a ton of money on the 2008 Games. A couple of cities have pulled out of the bidding, saying that it's just become too costly and they don't think they'll get that money back, that it's not a good investment for them.
And the cities that have pulled out are cities in rich countries. Most of the guys who remain are in places like Kazakhstan or, of course, Beijing, because China perennially has enough money to spend on just about anything that its leaders want.
And Ukraine, which many don't think would be a serious bid at this point.
Yeah, but when you have places like Stockholm or Munich or St. Davos in Switzerland, I mean, these are places where you think of people as being very, very prosperous. So if they don't think it's worth it, you begin to wonder, what's the point? I've been wondering, I have to confess for years, when the Olympics would reach the breaking point.
I'm not sure if it's so much the cost of facilities. I think the cost of doing business is IOC related. The fees you have to pay to IOC, and some people accuse it of being a relatively corrupt organization. It's become an industry in itself. I think we can still stage good Olympics and make them affordable. But this whole IOC thing is just running away from us, I think.
Do you think you may see a day where, like Vancouver, that already has the venues in place, the housing in place, would just have the recurring games? Maybe they would take turns with one or two other cities on a rotating basis?
Yeah, I think it makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, Vancouver was quite a successful Winter Olympics. So you don't hear a lot of griping after the fact on their investment. You heard a lot in the lead up as they're doing all the spending, but I don't think there's an awful lot of buyer's remorse in that case.
They managed to do a lot of spending in a way that created some permanent value.
That's the key.
In the region, and that was good. So good planning is certainly a key to it, because as we proved in Montreal, with a Summer Olympics, which are perhaps a little less elaborate to put on, you can blow your brains out financially, even if you're not spending tons of money, if you spend it really, really badly.
And that was what, about $1.5 billion over budget and mismanagement? And
yeah, and a stadium that wasn't even completed by the time the games happened.
And the city finally paid off that debt
It finally did, yeah, but just recently, so it's decades.
And they use that as an example, but you think we're talking apples and oranges here?
Sort of apples and oranges, but I do have the impression that, for example, the Russian Olympics, were just incredibly, excessively expensive. And of course they were put on in a city where the weather wasn't really cooperating. It wasn't really a winter sports city to a great extent. Maybe we'll see less of this utter stupidity of trying to put on a Winter Olympics in a place where you have to have kind of snow trucked in. Actually, in Vancouver, they had to do that too.
And we hear from time to time New York talking again about trying to get a third Olympics to Lake Placid. And the model you hear most often is that it would have to include Montreal, it would have to include Albany, it would have to be a regional games. But do you think that potentially now the Olympics are too expensive even for a regional approach here, that it would just be impossible to fund that?
To have the scale of events like a major downhill course, there's only a few world-class regions that can really put on a major downhill course. I think you have to do it regionally, and they are. We don't see that when we're watching them on TV, but you have venues that are 2 or 3 hours away from the main stadium or the main ice skating rinks and that sort of thing. So they're regional, 2 or 3 hours.
Lake Placid still does have some of the venues. They have the bobsled track,
Sure.
They have Whiteface Mountain, but
we're emptying fabulous cross-country skiing facilities.
We're emptying prisons so we can start housing athletes again. So,
Good point. Let's talk a little bit about Amazon. of flexing its muscle.
My hero, and they're no longer my hero.
Give us the backstory.
They're now the axis of evil or something. Well, Amazon is, of course, every consumer's best friend. If you do a lot of reading, and these days, if you buy almost anything, smaller than a car, they'll ship it to you, and they'll ship it to you at just about the best price you'll find anywhere. But there's an ugly reality behind that, which is that they are hammering the daylights out of their suppliers, just something that Walmart used to be accused of doing too. And so what you're seeing is not just the savings from efficiency, you're also seeing the savings from bare knuckle bargaining and maybe intimidation, and certainly intimidation in the case of Hachette, the big French publisher that publishes people like James Patterson, huge best-selling books. Amazon got into a dispute with Hachette over pricing, and suddenly the Hachette books were in a less favorable position. The buy buttons disappeared for a while. Shipping went from being a couple of days to being 2 or 3 weeks. And it was a very clear effort to intimidate and bludgeon Hachette into doing exactly as Amazon demanded that they do, and it still hasn't been solved, but Amazon has taken such a blow to its reputation. People like Amazon because they thought of it as being a company that was just totally focused on customer service. But now it turns out that if Amazon is angry at a publisher, they don't mind hurting their customers as they're intimidating the publisher, because of course there are an awful lot of customers who want to buy a best-selling book. And it's not like buying something off the shelf at Walmart where if you don't get one brand of pickle, you can buy another brand of pickle and you don't care. If you want Patterson's latest bestseller, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be satisfied if they offer you some other author.
And as you mentioned, this has been the knock against Walmart for a number of years. In many cases, did that come back to haunt them, or did customers just accept it and move on? And is this different?
It is very different. First of all, it wasn't as visible in the case of Walmart. Amazon customers for books tend to be well-read, obviously, and so they know right away. I don't know how many Walmart customers really aware of the criticisms of Walmart. Those criticisms never got the kind of headlines all over the country that these ones are, this situation with Amazon. But secondly, what's really crucial is that at Walmart you walk in and you want to buy peanut butter, and if you can't buy Jif, well, Kraft is probably okay. If you want to buy James Patterson, James Rollins maybe just won't do it for you, and you're going to be angry at Amazon, and you might click, because it's very easy to click when you're buying things online, go to Barnes & Noble. And Barnes & Noble is aware of that. They've got everything from Hachette on sale this week, I've read. Walmart has everything from Hachette on sale this week. The other retailers who are just barely hanging on by their fingernails in the book market, they see that this is a final desperate chance for them to show that maybe people shouldn't be so loyal to Amazon.
I think that also Amazon's trying to change the discussion from the big publishing houses, which as an author myself, I recognize that the authors make very, very little when you publish through a big publishing house unless you're a big name writer, to trying to induce people to do more self-publication through Amazon. Amazon will process their books, give them a venue that most of us now look as one of the places we look for when we look for books, and I think they even want to get into the printing on demand kind of business as well. So this is really, I think, also a way of Amazon trying to change the discussion of how books are brought to market.
I don't think it is. I think that Amazon is trying to do that. They're trying to do exactly what you say, and I agree with you completely that there could be real benefits both to authors and readers from kind of cutting out so many middlemen and maybe not always having a conventional publisher in the process. But this specific dispute with Hachette is all about bludgeoning a big publisher into accepting Amazon's terms or being killed.
Right.
Speaking of Amazon, its home base, Seattle. The city made history this week by announcing that it's going to set its minimum wage at $15 an hour over several years, phase it in up to $15 an hour by 2021. We're seeing more and more cities that are taking these steps where they want to be able to set their own minimum wage and forget what the state is doing.
Yeah.
Right, and Seattle's already at a relatively high minimum wage base, so $15 over 7 years or so, that might be a 30 or 40% increase.
Washington State is at $9.32
right.
an hour now.
So we're only really talking about a 4 or 5% increase per year. You add a little bit of inflation into that, so we're only really talking about a 2 or 3% increase per year. It sounds dramatic, though, and it is. And we've talked on this show before about there's probably more effective ways, though, if you're worried about bringing that working class family up beyond the poverty level. I just don't think that the minimum wage is the best tool. I think that we should be much more frequently exploring a dramatic expansion of the earned income tax credit and these other alternatives that really trigger or target that working class family.
You have to be cautious in increasing the minimum wage, and when I saw the $15 figure, I was a bit shocked, because I am a big supporter of having a minimum wage that lets a person actually survive. And the federal minimum wage, $7.25 now, is just doesn't do it. It's not a living wage. But then when I looked at the phasing in over many years of going up to $15, and the Washington State minimum wage is already $9.30 an hour, so it's not a huge increase year by year, so it shouldn't shock small business and make people go out of business. And even though I agree with Colin that there are many other ancillary kinds of policies that can help low-income workers, I think it's absolutely foundational to have a minimum wage that you can live on. And I don't know how far President Obama is going to get with trying to raise the federal minimum wage, but I'm very happy to see that there's been a bit of a trend in the last year or so for states and municipalities to increase their minimum wages, and you know, thank goodness. I mean, we all know about the widening gap between the wages of people at the top and wages of people at the bottom, and we tend to focus on the people at the top, you know, the 1% who are making massive salaries. Well, that's a little worrisome, but what's far more worrisome is that people at the bottom have been going nowhere. People in the middle have at least been making modest gains, sort of keeping up with inflation or a bit better. People at the bottom have been going nowhere, so they've been getting poorer and poorer and poorer.
And well, I think even the median income household, though, has been getting poorer. The median income households haven't
been keeping up with inflation.
Haven't been keeping up with inflation.
And
so
you point out about President Obama wanting to raise it to 10.10, but I think a number of these cities will say that's part of the reason they're doing this is because that's been blocked by Republicans in Congress. They don't see that happening, and
they feel that something must happen, even if it results in a somewhat fragmented system.
San Francisco, Chicago,
San Diego,
San Diego, other cities looking at doing the same. New York City looking at doing the same. Mayor Bill de Blasio this week saying that they're looking at a $13 an hour minimum wage. Not sure how many years that would be spread over. Governor Cuomo had opposed that in the past, saying that it should be the state that sets the minimum wage. But after some politics this past weekend where Bill de Blasio helped the governor get on the Working Families Party on the ballot for November, which is important to Governor Cuomo, this week the governor has been much more willing to entertain the possibility of letting New York City set its own minimum wage.
Surely that's a coincidence.
Right, and New York City probably ought to. The wage reality between the North Country, say in New York City, there's probably very few people at the minimum wage in New York City, because you couldn't even closely, even with 2 income earners, survive in that city. But here, your $8 or $9 an hour wage can go much, much further.
Yeah, as long as New York City doesn't go nuts and you know, make the minimum wage so high that they drive a lot of smaller firms out of the city. Colin's right. It's just common sense that in New York City you need to earn a bit more than if you live even as little as 20 or 30 miles outside the city. There's a big difference in the cost of living.
That is our business edition for this month. We want to thank Colin and Jay, and thank you for watching. For all of us here at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Hellick. We'll see you next time.